You're not welcome here anymore." Her uncle said it without looking up from his boots. Lillian Hart stood in the doorway of the only home she had left, 20 years old, widowed, 6 months, holding everything she owned in a single cloth bag. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She turned around and walked back into the sun. If you've ever been told you were too much of a burden to love, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel. Follow Lillian's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Lillian Hart was turned out of her uncle's house, the temperature was already climbing toward unbearable before 8 o'clock. She walked down the center of the main street in Amarillo, Texas, with her cloth bag pressed against her side and her chin level with the ground, even though every part of her wanted to fold in half and disappear. She was 20 years old, 6 months a widow, and utterly alone in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people standing around her. People passed her on that street. A woman in a blue dress looked at her once, then looked away. A shopkeeper sweeping his front step watched her go by without offering a word. 2 men on horseback slowed down enough to take note of the young woman walking alone, then moved on with the easy disinterest of people who had decided she was not their concern. Lillian had learned something in the months since her husband James died. Being young and female and widowed in 1882 did not earn you sympathy. It earned you suspicion. What happened to him, people asked, as though she might have had something to do with it. Why don't you go back to your family, they asked, as though family was a door that stayed open no matter what. Aren't you a little young to have been married, they asked, as though her grief was somehow less legitimate because she hadn't had enough years to accumulate it properly. James Hart had died of a fever in the winter of 1881. He was 23 years old. They had been married for 11 months. And in those 11 months, Lillian had built an entire life around the quiet certainty of his presence, the way he handed her coffee in the morning, without asking, the way he laughed at his own jokes, before he finished telling them, the way he called her Lily when no one else was listening. Then the fever came, and within 3 weeks, Lily became Lillian again. Lillian, who had no property in her own name. Lillian, who had no trade beyond what she'd learned helping her mother cook. Lillian, who had returned to her uncle's farm outside Amarillo with a dead husband's name and no clear future, and who had lasted exactly 4 months before the weight of her presence became too much for a man who had his own family to feed. "You're not welcome here anymore," her uncle had said that morning. He hadn't shouted it, hadn't been cruel about it in any deliberate way. He'd simply said it the way a man says it's going to rain, as a statement of fact, as information delivered without pleasure or apology. "I have 5 of my own," he said. "I can't carry a 6th. "I haven't asked you to carry me," Lillian said. "I cook. I clean. I mend. I've been working for my keep since the day I arrived." "Margaret doesn't feel comfortable," he said. Margaret was his wife. That was the end of the conversation. Lillian stood on that main street in Amarillo with 52 cents in her pocket and asked herself what a woman with no family, no money, and no property was supposed to do. She thought about the answer for exactly as long as it took her to reach the far end of the street. Then she saw the notice tacked to the post outside the general store. Cook wanted cattle drive departing June 4th, hard work, long miles, fair pay. Inquire within at the Hayes Ranch office. Lillian read it twice. A cattle drive. She had never been on a cattle drive. She had never been west of Amarillo. She had cooked for farmhands during harvest season, and for church suppers, and for her husband, and for her uncle's 5 children. But she had no experience cooking on an open range for 25 working cowboys. But there was nothing else on that notice board that applied to her, and 52 cents wasn't going to last until something better came along. She went inside. Bicho. The man behind the counter looked at her the way everyone had been looking at her lately, with a quick calculation running behind his eyes, tallying what she was and what she wasn't, and arriving at an answer before she'd opened her mouth. "I'm here about the cook position," she said. "For the cattle drive." "Yes." He studied her. How old are you? Old enough to cook. That's not what I asked. 20, she said. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. You ever cooked on a drive before? No. You ever even been on a trail drive? No. Do you have any idea what that work involves? Tell me, she said, and I'll tell you if I can do it. He leaned back in his chair. Up before 4 every morning. 3 meals a day for 25 men who will complain no matter what you put in front of them. You drive the chuck wagon ahead of the herd, which means you're alone most of the day in territory that can kill you 6 different ways. You keep your supplies clean and dry and organized, or people die. If something goes wrong, medicine bandages emergency food that's on you. The trail boss expects his cook to be the most reliable person on the whole crew, because when everything else falls apart, the one thing that has to hold is the food. Lillian looked at him steadily. What does it pay? He told her. It was more money than she had seen in 6 months. When do I meet the trail boss? You dumb dog. Colton Hayes was not what she expected. She had imagined a large man, loud and barrel-chested, the kind of man whose authority came from volume. That was the version of trail boss she had heard about in stories. Colton Hayes was tall, but quiet. He moved with the economy of a man who had learned long ago that energy wasted was energy gone, and out here, energy was not something you spent carelessly. He was 35 years old. He looked like someone who had been through something and come out the other side not entirely intact. When Lillian was shown into his office, a small room off the back of the supply warehouse, he was standing at a table covered in maps and supply lists, and he didn't look up when she came in. He said, "Sit down." She sat. He finished what he was writing, put down his pencil, and looked at her. She had the sense that in the time it took him to complete that sentence, he had already formed most of his opinion. "You're here for the cook position." "Yes." "James told me about you. Said you're a widow." "Yes." "How long?" 6 months. Something moved across his face. Not pity, something more careful than that. "Can you cook for 25 men on an open fire with whatever supplies you have and whatever the land provides when the supplies run short?" "Yes." "Can you keep a wagon moving and know when to stop and know the difference between a problem you solve yourself and one you bring to me?" "Yes." "Can you do all of this with men who may not treat you the way you deserve to be treated and handle that without requiring me to spend my time managing the situation?" Lillian met his eyes. "With respect," she said, "I've spent the last 6 months being somewhere I wasn't wanted. I know how to manage a situation." Colton was quiet for a long moment. "The last woman who tried to cook for a trail crew quit after 2 weeks," he said. "Said the men were intolerable." "Were they?" "Yes." "Were the conditions bad?" "Yes." "Did the food hold up?" "Until she left." Lillian folded her hands in her lap. "Then the problem wasn't the cooking. It was that she had somewhere better to go." He looked at her for a long time after that. "Do you?" he asked. "Have somewhere better to go?" She held his gaze. "No," she said simply. "I don't." He nodded once. "You start the day after tomorrow, 6 in the morning. I'll show you the wagon." That night, Lillian sat alone in the small room she'd rented above the dry goods store and asked herself whether she'd just made the worst decision of her life. She had agreed to travel hundreds of miles across open country with 25 men she didn't know on a cattle drive she'd never attempted for a trail boss who had barely looked at her. She thought about what it meant to have no choice, and then she got up and started making a list of what she would need to bring. She arrived at the Hayes Ranch at 5:50 the following morning. The wagon was already hitched. The ranch hands loading the supply barrels stopped to look at her. Nobody said hello. One man, wide-shouldered, sunburned, with the kind of expression that dared you to react, leaned against the wheel of the wagon and said, "You're the cook." "Yes." "You look about 16. I'm 20. You cook before Thai?" "Many times." "For a drive?" "No." He exchanged a glance with the man beside him. "This ought to be something," he said, and walked away. Lillian climbed up to the wagon seat and began checking the inventory against the list Colton had given her. 15 minutes later, Colton appeared. He looked at the list in her hands, then at the barrels she'd already recounted and reorganized by order of use. He said nothing, but he looked at the barrels again, and then he moved on. The crew's name for her arrived on the first morning. She'd been awake since 3:30, fire going before 4, coffee ready before anyone rolled out of their bedrolls. When the men came stumbling toward the fire in the gray pre-dawn, the smell of coffee and salt pork hit them, and a few of them stopped like they'd run into a wall. "Cookie," one of them said, reaching past her for the coffee pot. She turned. "Breakfast will be ready in 10 minutes, she said. "There's a line. You wait your turn." The man blinked at her. "I just want coffee." "And you'll have it," she said pleasantly, "when it's your turn." He looked at the men behind him, clearly expecting someone to back him up. Nobody did. She wasn't sure if that was respect or simple hunger, but either way it worked. From that morning forward, she was Cookie. She accepted the name the same way she accepted everything else on this drive, as something to be managed, not fought. By the end of the first week, she had developed a system. Not just for cooking, but for reading the men. There were 25 of them, and every one of them was different, and what they needed from food was not the same as what they needed from her. And those two things were also not the same as what she was willing to give. The young ones, the boys, who were maybe 17, 18 out here for their first drive, needed extra food without being made to feel like she was noticing they needed it. She learned to plate their meals just slightly heavier than the others without drawing attention to it. The older hands needed strong coffee and no commentary about anything before the sun was fully up. The difficult ones, the men who pushed, who made comments, who watched her the way men sometimes watched young women, they had decided were available because they were alone. Those men needed clear, direct lines, drawn with no anger attached, because anger was fuel for certain types, and she'd learned that lesson early. One man named Garrett was the loudest of the difficult ones. On the fourth day, he sat down beside the fire while she was cleaning up after the noon meal and said, "My wife's a better cook than you." Lillian continued scrubbing the pot. "Then I imagine you miss her," she said. Garrett blinked. "What? If your wife's cooking is better, you must be missing home." She looked at him evenly. "That's hard, being away from the people who matter." He opened his mouth, closed it, and got up and walked away. She watched him go. That was the last time Garrett made a comment about her cooking. The first serious moment came at the end of the first week. One of the younger hands, a boy named Billy, who couldn't have been more than 17, got thrown from his horse during a routine repositioning of the herd. It wasn't a dramatic fall. Nothing broke. But he hit the ground hard enough to bite through his lip and scrape his hands raw on the rocks, and by the time he limped back to camp that evening, he was running a slight fever and his hands were already starting to swell. The drive was still in its early miles. There was no town within a reasonable distance. The crew's medical supplies were on the chuck wagon. Lillian had them organized. She cleaned his hands carefully while he tried not to wince. "You don't have to," he started. "Hold still. I'm fine. You have grit in this cut here that will turn it bad by morning if it doesn't come out," she said. "So hold still." He held still. When she was done, she gave him clean water and told him to drink all of it, and she held back a portion of the evening meal she'd made and set it aside wrapped in cloth so it would still be warm when he came back from tending his horse. He found it without knowing who'd left it. She watched him look around camp trying to figure it out. She didn't tell him. But Colton, who had come to the wagon for the supply inventory that evening, saw the exchange. He didn't say anything. He simply noted it. Mo. 3 days after that, something shifted. Lillian was awake before even her usual time, the sky still fully dark, the stars still visible, the air carrying the cold edge that sometimes came unexpectedly, even in June. She was starting the fire when she heard footsteps. not the shuffling, half-asleep approach of a cowboy heading for an early bathroom break. These were deliberate. She didn't reach for anything, but she straightened. Colton came around the side of the wagon. He stopped when he saw her already at the fire. "You're up early," he said. "So are you." He didn't explain himself. She didn't ask. He sat down on the water barrel she kept near the fire, which was slightly more comfortable than the ground, and held his hands toward the warmth. After a few minutes, she said, "Coffee won't be ready for another half hour." "I know." Another silence. "I checked the herd," he said. "Nothing's wrong. I don't sleep well in open country." She looked at him. It was the first personal thing he had said to her. She thought carefully about what to do with it. "My husband couldn't sleep during thunderstorms," she said. "He'd get up and read by lamplight until they passed. Drove me half mad because it always woke me up too. But after he was gone..." She stopped, started again. "I found myself lying awake during storms, waiting to hear the lamp." Colton looked at the fire. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know something about that." They sat in silence until the coffee was ready. She poured 2 cups. He took his, and they sat together in the dark for a while longer, which was not the same as talking, but was also not nothing. By the second week, something was changing in the camp. Not dramatically, not in any way a person could point to and name. But the line for meals was more orderly. The complaints were quieter. The men who had been loudest in their assessments of her competence had grown noticeably quieter on the subject. She thought it was because the food was good, but she overheard something one evening that told her it was something else. 2 of the older hands were talking near the wagon, Hector and a man called Sands, and they didn't know she was on the other side of it. "She doesn't rattle," Hector said. "Nope," said Sands. "Garrett gave her his full treatment, and she just..." Hector made a sound of quiet amazement. "She didn't even blink." "Woman's been through something," Sands said. "You can tell. That kind of steady don't come from nowhere." A pause. "Hayes watches her," Hector said. Another pause. "I noticed that too," Sands said. Then one of them moved away and she couldn't hear anymore. She stood still for a moment on her side of the wagon. "Colton watches her." She thought about that for a long time. Summed. On the 14th day of the drive, the incident with the water happened. They were crossing a stretch of dry country where the next reliable water source was supposed to be 20 miles ahead. The herd needed water every day, and so did the crew. The barrels on the chuck wagon were the backup supply. Lillian had counted the barrels that morning. 3 were full. 1 was 3/4. 1 was half. By midday, when she stopped to prepare the noon meal and checked again, one of the full barrels had developed a crack along the bottom seam and had been leaking slowly all morning. They were down to 3¼ barrels for 25 men and several hundred pounds of supplies that needed water in preparation, plus the personal needs of the crew. She did the calculation quickly, and then she went to find Colton. She found him at the front of the herd, talking with his lead rider. "We have a water problem," she said. He turned immediately. She told him. Precise numbers, no drama. This was what they had. This was what they needed. This was what she could do to stretch it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How short are we? If we're 20 miles from water and hit nothing between, I can make it work for the crew on strict rations, but the animals need to get there by tomorrow mid-afternoon at the latest. I can push the herd. There's also a draw about 8 miles east that may have water," she said. "I heard 2 of the hands mention it this morning." He looked at her. "You heard them?" "I pay attention," she said. "It's faster to check the draw first, even if it takes us slightly off route, than to discover tomorrow we don't have enough for the crew to function." He thought for 5 seconds. "I'll send someone to check the draw," he said. "Ration the water your way starting now. I'll need you to back me when the men push back." "You have my backing," he said. "You always have my backing." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to the wagon and started implementing the rationing, before anyone had a chance to complain. Some of them tried anyway. She told them there was a plan, and the trail boss had approved it, and the next man who took water outside the ration schedule would find his meals reduced proportionally. Nobody took water outside the ration schedule. The draw had water. They made it with room to spare. That night, Colton found her checking the repaired barrel and said simply, "Good thinking today." It was 4 words, but she stood a little straighter for the rest of the evening. She didn't know what was happening to her. That was the honest truth of it. She had come on this drive because she had no other option. She had expected it to be difficult and lonely and temporary. She had expected to count down the days until it was over, and she could find something else, something stable, something with walls and a roof, and the small dignities that came with belonging somewhere. She had not expected the drive to become something she was good at. She had not expected the crew to become not friends exactly, but people she cared about. Billy with his healing hands and his shyness around the horses. Old Sands, who took his hat off when he sat near her, though she'd never asked. Hector, who had started leaving firewood stacked near her workstation without mentioning it. She had not expected the long conversations with Colton Hayes. They had started accidentally pre-dawn meetings at the fire or late evenings when everyone else was asleep and she was still working and he was doing a final check of the camp. They had started without intent. But over 2 weeks, they had accumulated into something. He told her about the ranch in Montana. About the land, the pace of it, the way the mountains looked in winter. He told her about his children. Thomas was 8, serious, already learning to read cattle. Emma was 6, curious about everything, afraid of nothing. He didn't tell her about his wife. Not directly. But once when she mentioned that her husband had laughed at his own jokes, he said, "My wife used to laugh at everyone else's jokes, but never tell any of her own. I never understood that." Used to. She heard the tense. She didn't push. But that night, she understood that the quiet sadness she sometimes caught on his face was the same kind of weight she carried. Different shape. Same heaviness. On the last evening of the 2nd week after the men had settled and the camp was quiet, Lillian was washing out the coffee kettle when something cold landed on her hand. She looked up. The sky was thick with clouds that hadn't been there an hour ago. She put down the kettle and walked to where she could see the western horizon. What she saw there made her set down everything she was holding and go find Colton immediately. He was already looking at the same horizon when she reached him. "Is that what I think it is?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. The western sky was dark. Not the darkness of night, the darkness of something moving. "Yeah," he said. And then he was shouting orders before she'd taken another breath. Lillian ran back to the wagon. She had already been thinking about what needed to be secured before the rain hit, and she had been wrong. Because that was not a rainstorm coming across the Texas Panhandle. That was something else entirely, and they had until morning to prepare for it. She began moving faster. Because out here, what was coming toward them wasn't something you survived by waiting to see what it turned into. You prepared, you acted, or you didn't make it through to the other side. She started tying down the canvas covers on the supply barrels, working with hands that were steadier than her heart, and she didn't stop until everything that could be secured was secured. Whatever was coming, she would face it with everything she had. The storm hit before dawn, not rain, wind. The kind of wind that came off the open plains like something with a grudge tearing at canvas and rope and anything that wasn't nailed down or held by human hands. Lillian had secured the supply barrels the night before. She had tied down the canvas covers and checked every knot twice, and moved the most critical supplies, the medicine kit, the ammunition, the dried provisions that couldn't get wet, to the center of the wagon where the frame would give them the most protection. She had done everything right. And the wind still found a way. The canvas on the left side of the wagon tore free at 2 a.m. One of the knots she'd tied held perfectly. The one beside it, the one she'd trusted because it had been set by someone else when the wagon was first loaded, gave way completely, and the canvas whipped back into the darkness like something alive. Lillian was out of her bedroll before the sound finished echoing. She didn't think about what she was doing. She moved to the wagon, grabbed the loose canvas with both hands, and held on while the wind tried to strip it away from her. Her feet left the ground twice. She felt the rope burn through her palms. She held on. Let go of it. Colton was there. She hadn't heard him coming. He was at her side, and he took the canvas from her hands, and she let him take it because her hands were bleeding, and she could feel it now. The sharp sting of friction burns across both palms. Two other men appeared. They got the canvas down and secured. Colton turned to her immediately. Your hands. I'm fine. You're bleeding. The supplies are dry, she said. That's what matters. He looked at her for a moment in the dark, the wind still moving around them, and something shifted in his expression that she couldn't fully read. Come to the supply wagon, he said. I have to check the Lillian. Her name. Not Cookie. Not the cook. Her name in his voice in the dark, said with a firmness that was not unkind. She went. He wrapped her hands himself, working in the lamplight with the same economy he applied to everything. No wasted motion, no unnecessary commentary. He had done this before. She could tell by the way he worked. You've patched up Cowboys, she said. Too many times. Is it usually self-inflicted? He glanced up. Frequently, he said. She almost laughed. It came out more like a breath, but it was the closest thing to a laugh she'd managed in, longer than she could remember, and she thought he noticed because something in his face changed. He finished tying the bandage and didn't let go of her hand right away. Just one beat longer than necessary. Then he did. Get some sleep, he said. You'll be up in 2 hours anyway. She went back to her bedroll. She lay there in the dark with her hands wrapped and her heart doing something she had not given it permission to do, and she told it firmly to stop. It didn't entirely listen. By the time the sun came up, she had made herself a very clear argument. She was on a cattle drive. She was here to cook. The trail boss had been decent to her because he was a decent man, and that was where it began and ended. Anything else was her own loneliness looking for something to attach itself to, and she was too old for that kind of thinking. She was 20 years old. She felt about 45. She got up and started the fire. The men came to breakfast and found something they hadn't expected: biscuits. Despite the wind, despite the chaos of the night, despite the fact that biscuit making required a level of calm and precision that the pre-dawn storm should have made impossible. Sands took one bit into it and looked at Lillian with something approaching reverence. How? He said. Cast iron holds heat well, she said. And I started them before the wind got bad. You were cooking at midnight. I was preparing at midnight, she said, in case the morning was difficult. Sands looked at the biscuit again. Then he looked at Hector, who was standing beside him. She was cooking at midnight, he said. Hector took a biscuit, said nothing. But he took off his hat, which he sometimes did when he sat near her, and which she'd come to understand as the closest this particular man got to expressing gratitude. Garrett reached for a biscuit without looking at her. She moved the plate 2 inches to the left. He looked up. Morning, she said pleasantly. He held her gaze. He said, morning. She moved the plate back. He took a biscuit. That was the closest they had come to a peace treaty, and both of them knew it. The drive moved on. The third week brought new country and new problems. The land changed under them, rougher, drier, with stretches where the cattle bunched up, and the hands worked twice as hard to keep the animals moving. The heat climbed. The tempers climbed with it. That was when the trouble with Dawson started. Dawson was a man Lillian had been watching since the first day. He was not the loudest. He was not the most obviously difficult. He was something more careful. A man who watched her the way certain men watched things they were deciding whether they wanted, and she had kept herself calibrated to his temperature, the way she kept herself calibrated to the weather, because both of them could change fast and without warning. It was the 19th day of the drive. The noon meal was ready. The men were coming in from the herd in groups the way they always did, and she was moving between the fire and the wagon when Dawson appeared at her elbow. He was too close. She didn't step away. She had learned that stepping away gave men like Dawson a signal, and the signal was wrong. "You're out here all alone," he said. His voice was conversational. That was the most dangerous register. "Long ways from town. Same as everyone on this drive," she said. She kept moving. He moved with her. "Most of the others at least have somebody, family somewhere." "Is there something you need for your meal?" she asked. "I'm just making conversation." "You're standing too close," she said. Still calm. Still moving. "Step back." He didn't. "I'm just being friendly." She turned and looked at him directly. Not with anger. Anger was the wrong tool here. She looked at him with the complete level clarity of someone who was not afraid and was not going to pretend to be afraid and was going to make sure he understood both of those things before the next 5 seconds were over. "You're being something," she said. "But it's not friendly. Step back and get your plate or come back when there's enough left over for you. Those are your choices." Something moved in his face. He stepped back. He got his plate. She watched him go. Her heart was going fast, but her hands were not shaking, and she considered that a victory. What she didn't see was that Colton, coming in from the far side of the herd, had watched the last 30 seconds of that exchange from a distance too far to hear but close enough to understand what had happened. He didn't say anything at noon, but that evening she saw him speaking with Dawson near the horses. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw Dawson's posture change the way a man's posture changes when the person speaking to him has the authority to make his life significantly more difficult. Dawson didn't come near her again. She never asked Colton about the conversation. He never brought it up. But the next morning she poured his coffee first before everyone else, which she hadn't done before. He noticed. He said nothing, but he noticed. 3 days after the Dawson incident, young Billy found her near the wagon after the evening meal. He was nervous about something. She could tell by the way he kept putting his weight on different feet. "Is there something wrong?" she asked. "No," he said. "Then, maybe." She waited. "The men were talking," he said. "Some of them. Not all, but some." She turned to look at him directly. "About what?" Billy looked at the ground. "About how you handled Dawson. And about some other things. About whether you should be here." "What did they say?" "That a young widow's got no business on a trail drive." He said it quickly, the way people say things they don't agree with, but feel obligated to report. "That it makes the men complicated, is what they said." She studied him for a moment. "What do you think, Billy?" He looked up. "I think if you weren't here we'd all be eating worse and arguing more," he said. "And I think my hands wouldn't have healed right without what you did." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Both parts." He nodded, still fidgeting. I thought you should know." "I appreciate it," she said. "Now go get some sleep before I have to start breakfast." He went. She stayed where she was and thought about what he'd said. She had known, of course. Not those specific words, but the general temperature of it. She had always known that there were men on this drive who thought her presence was a problem. She was not naive about what she was, a young woman alone in a world that had very specific ideas about where young women alone were supposed to be, and those ideas did not include cattle drives. But she also knew something those men didn't. She knew that she was still here, that she had not quit, that she had not cried in front of anyone, not even on the nights she'd wanted to, that the food was good and the supplies were managed, and the wagon had kept moving, and she had held on through a windstorm with bleeding hands, and made biscuits by midnight, and handled Dawson without once raising her voice. She was still here, and that was going to have to be enough for now. She went to check on the supplies before she slept. On the 23rd day, something happened that changed the temperature of the entire camp. They'd been pushing the herd hard for 2 days. Colton was trying to make up time after the storm had cost them half a day, and the men were stretched thin. Tired men made mistakes, and tired men with short tempers made arguments. The argument started at the evening fire between two hands named Reese and Calloway. She never found out exactly what it was about. By the time she heard the raised voices, it had already escalated past words. They were in each other's faces. The rest of the crew had formed a loose ring around them, the way men did when they weren't sure whether to intervene or watch. Lillian set down what she was carrying. She did not think carefully about what happened next. She simply walked to the center of that ring, put herself between Reese and Calloway, and said, "Dinner is ready." Total silence. Both men stared at her. She looked at Reese. "You've been on your feet since 4 this morning. You're hungry and exhausted, and whatever this is, it will look different after you eat." She looked at Calloway. "Same goes for you." Neither of them moved. She picked up 2 plates from the stack she'd been carrying, held them out to the men. Calloway took his. After a long moment, Reese took his. The ring around them dissolved. Lillian went back to the fire and continued serving without any further commentary. From the edge of camp, Colton had watched. He hadn't moved to intervene because he'd been watching her, and he'd wanted to see what she would do, and he'd been completely unprepared for what she actually did. He'd expected her to call for him. She hadn't. He'd expected the situation to require his authority. It hadn't. She had walked into the middle of 2 armed, exhausted, angry men and stopped a fight with 2 plates of food and the complete refusal to acknowledge that there had been anything particularly remarkable about doing so. That night after the camp was quiet, Colton found her at the wagon. "You know that could have gone differently," he said. She glanced at him. "It could have. They might not have backed down." "They were hungry," she said. "Hungry men respond to food. It's not complicated." It was still a risk. She turned to look at him. "Mr. Hayes," she said, and her voice was not unkind, but it was direct. "Everything on this drive is a risk. The water barrel that cracked was a risk. The storm was a risk. Dawson was a risk. I manage the risks I can manage, and I call you for the ones I can't. Tonight was one I could manage." He was quiet. "You called me Mr. Hayes," he said. "That's your name." "You usually say Colton." She blinked. He was right. She had stopped thinking of him as Mr. Hayes somewhere in the second week, and she hadn't noticed the shift. "Would you prefer—" "No," he said. "I prefer Colton." A pause. "I just noticed." She went back to what she was doing. He stayed. After a few minutes, he said, "My wife would have called for me." She wasn't sure what to say to that. She wasn't afraid of much, he continued, but she believed in handling things through the right channels. She would have come to me first. Lillian measured her next words carefully. "Maybe she trusted you to handle it," she said. "That's not a smaller thing than what I did. It's just a different way of being strong." He was quiet again. "That's a generous reading," he said finally. "I didn't know her," Lillian said. "I can only give her the benefit of the doubt." He looked at her with something she couldn't name, and she turned away before she could try. "Good night, Colton." "Good night, Lillian." She walked back to her bedroll. She lay awake for a long time. On the 27th day, she found the wooden handle. She had noticed the crack in her cast-iron pot's handle 2 days before she had been managing it carefully, using a folded cloth as a buffer to protect her hands from the weakened wood. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone. It wasn't an emergency. It was manageable. That morning, before anyone else was awake, she came to the wagon to start the fire and found something lying on top of the supply box. A handle. Wooden. New. Smooth where the old one had been rough-shaped to fit the pot the way the original had been shaped, but without the crack, without the splinter that had been catching her palm for 2 days. Someone had taken the measurements from her pot and cut and carved a replacement. She stood there looking at it for a moment. She reached out and picked it up, turned it over. No note, no indication. She looked toward the rest of the camp. Most of the men were still asleep. Colton was awake. He was standing near the horses with his back to her, checking something on one of the saddles. She walked over. "You made this," she said. He turned, looked at the handle she was holding. The old one would have failed eventually. You could have told me. I would have managed it. I know you would have, he said. You manage everything. He turned back to the saddle. I just thought it might be easier if you didn't have to. She stood there. Just for a moment, she stood there and let herself feel the full weight of what it meant for someone to notice something she hadn't asked about, to address a difficulty she had been quietly absorbing, to hand her something easier without making her ask for it. Her husband had done that. James had done that. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed it until this exact second, standing in the early morning air with a wooden handle in her bandaged hands. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not entirely dry. She walked back to the wagon before he could see. He didn't follow. But she thought from the change in the quality of the silence behind her that he might have turned to watch her go. The days built on each other. She started to understand the rhythm of the drive, not just the logistical rhythm, the meals and the water and the supplies, but the emotional rhythm, which was something no job notice ever told you about. She learned which evenings the men needed someone to talk to and which evenings they needed to be left completely alone. She learned that Sands told the same 3 stories on rotation, and that the crew had stopped listening years ago, but that he didn't need them to listen, he just needed to talk. She learned that Hector prayed every night before he slept, and that if she was still working near him when he did it, she moved quietly and gave him the space. She learned that Colton rode the perimeter of the camp at midnight every night before he slept. She knew this because she was often still awake when he came back. They had fallen into something she didn't want to name. It refused to name it, but it was a thing that had a shape. Pre-dawn coffee, late evening camp checks, conversations that started about practical things and moved sideways into personal ones before either of them noticed the transition. He told her about Montana, about the specific smell of the air after rain in the mountains, about the way the valley looked at sunrise in October when the aspen had turned and everything was gold against the dark peaks. She told him about the house she and James had been planning to build, the way they had spent their last good evening together, arguing pleasantly about whether the kitchen should have a north-facing or south-facing window. "What did you decide?" Colton asked. "South," she said. "I wanted the morning light." "That's the right answer," he said. She looked at him. "Did your house in Montana get the right window?" she asked. Something crossed his face. "My wife chose east," he said. "For the same reason, actually. Morning light." A pause. "Do you still live in the same house?" she asked carefully. He was quiet for a moment. "I haven't changed anything," he said. "The children's things are where she put them. The kitchen is the way she arranged it." A pause. "Thomas tells me I should change things. Emma doesn't say anything, but I think she's glad I haven't." "Emma's right," Lillian said. He looked at her. "Not because things shouldn't change," she said, "but because she needs time before they do. There's a difference between keeping something and being trapped by it." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "There is." She looked away first. She always looked away first, because she was afraid of what she would do if she didn't. 31 days into the drive, everything broke open. It started with something small. A letter. One of the other hands had received it when they'd passed through a small supply town, a brief stop, less than 2 hours, just long enough to replenish certain provisions and check for correspondence. Garrett had gotten a letter from his wife. He read it alone, which was his right. But afterward, his mood shifted into something dark and closed, and he spent the rest of the day at the edge of himself. By evening, he had found something to direct that mood at. Lillian was the easiest target. She knew it was coming before it arrived. She had learned to read Garrett by now, the way his jaw set, the way he stopped making even his baseline minimum of eye contact. She prepared herself. He waited until the evening meal. He sat down with his plate and said loudly enough for the men around him to hear, "My wife says she heard about this drive having a woman cook. Says the church women in Amarillo think it's improper." The fire crackled. Nobody spoke. Lillian continued serving. "Church women in Amarillo," she said calmly, "have not eaten a meal I cooked. So their opinion is based on incomplete information. A few men kept their faces carefully neutral. One or two might have been concealing smiles. Garrett pushed further. Says it reflects poorly, he said. A widow woman traveling alone with men. Says decent women don't do such things. The word decent. She felt the weight of it, the specific cruelty packed into that particular word when directed at a young widow who had done nothing wrong and had nowhere else to go. She set down the serving spoon. She looked at Garrett directly. Your wife has never lost a husband, she said. Her voice was quiet, not cold, not angry. Quiet the way things get quiet when they're completely serious. She has never been told by the only family she had left that she was too much of a burden to keep. She has never had to make a choice between what was proper and what would allow her to survive. She paused. I hope she never has to. I genuinely hope that for her. But until she does, the word decent is not something she gets to use about me. Total silence. Garrett's jaw moved. Nothing came out. Lillian picked up the serving spoon. Do you want more biscuits? She said. Or are you finished? Garrett looked down at his plate. I'm finished, he said. He didn't mean the biscuits. Colton, sitting 3 places down the fire, had heard every word. He said nothing. He didn't need to, because every man at that fire had heard it, and every man at that fire had seen Garrett unable to respond. And the thing that happened in the silence after her last sentence was not something that could be undone. She had just redefined herself in front of the entire crew, not as Cookie, not as the widow, not as the inconvenient young woman some of them had doubted, as Lillian Hart, a person who told the truth without apology and without cruelty and without asking anyone's permission. Sands took off his hat. Old habit. But this time, every man near him watched him do it, and something passed between them in that gesture that didn't need words. That night, after the fire had burned low and most of the men had settled, Colton found her at the wagon as she knew he would. He didn't say anything for a long time. She was cleaning up, moving through the familiar end-of-day routine, with hands that had stopped shaking, and a heart that was only now beginning to settle. Garrett got a hard letter, Colton said. I know. That doesn't excuse what he said. No, she agreed. It doesn't. You handled it well. I handled it the only way I knew how to. He was quiet again. She could feel him looking at her. Do you ever get tired? He asked. Of having to handle things. Of always being the one who has to prove something. She stopped moving. She turned and looked at him. It was the most honest question anyone had asked her in longer than she could count. Yes, she said. Just that. Just yes. He nodded slowly. For what it's worth, he said, you've proven it. Whatever it was, anyone needed you to prove you've done it. Every man on this crew knows it. She held his gaze. Does that include you? She asked. He met her eyes fully. Lillian, he said. I knew it by the end of the first week. She didn't look away this time. Neither did he. The wind moved between them, quiet, steady, just the open land doing what it always did. And in that silence, something settled between them that neither of them named yet. But it was there, as real as the fire, as real as the miles they'd already traveled, as real as whatever was still coming for them both on the road ahead, and she could feel it now that something was coming. The way you feel a change in the weather before the sky shows it. She had survived everything so far. She intended to keep surviving, but surviving, she was beginning to understand, was not the same as living. And whatever was ahead of them still, she thought for the first time in a very long time, might be the difference between the two. She had stopped counting the days. That was how she knew something fundamental had changed. In the first week she had counted, every single one had tracked them the way a person tracks the hours of a difficult night, marking progress against an endpoint. Now she woke up and simply moved into the work, and the days organized themselves around the rhythm of the drive, rather than around her waiting for the drive to end. She wasn't sure exactly when that had happened. She thought it might have been the night of the biscuits, or the night of the wooden handle, or the night Colton had said "I knew it" by the end of the first week, and she had felt something lock into place inside her chest that had been loose and rattling since James died. Whatever it was, she was no longer marking time. She was living inside it. The 35th day began, the way the good days began. Cool air, clean fire, coffee, ready before the first man stirred. The herd had been quiet overnight. The trail ahead was open country with a water source confirmed less than a day's drive out. Everything was manageable. She should have known. The manageable days were always the ones that became something else by nightfall. It was Sands who first noticed the color of the western horizon at mid-morning. She was driving the chuck wagon ahead of the herd the way she always did, giving the cattle space behind her when she heard a horse riding up fast on her left. Sands pulled alongside. He wasn't the kind of man who rode fast for small reasons. "How much water do we have?" he asked instead of hello. She looked at him. 3 full barrels and 1/2. Why? He looked west. She looked west. The horizon had a color that took her a moment to identify. Not dark, the way rain clouds were dark. Not gray, the way an ordinary storm front came in. It was the specific yellow-brown darkness of something she had heard about, but never seen. "That's not a storm," she said. "No," said Sands. "It's not." Fire. Prairie fire. And it was moving toward them with the wind behind it, which meant it was moving faster than horses could comfortably run, and faster than a herd of cattle could be redirected without turning into something more dangerous than the fire itself. Sands was already turning his horse. "I'll get Hayes," he said. "Go," she said. She was already calculating. She had approximately 10 minutes, maybe 15, if the wind shifted before the decision window closed entirely. The chuck wagon could not outrun a prairie fire on open ground. That was a fact. Running was not an option she should spend any of her 10 minutes considering. What she needed to think about instead was the fire's path, the wagon's contents, and which of those contents could survive what was coming and which couldn't. The ammunition was in the center storage box. One stray ember in the wrong place, and they wouldn't just lose the wagon, they'd lose people. The medicine kit was on the left side, which was the fire's approach side. The water barrels were her most critical resource, not just for drinking, but for fighting. She stopped the wagon. She was already moving before the horses fully settled. She pulled the ammunition box from center storage and buried it under the canvas in the flattest, most protected section of the wagon bed. She moved the medicine kit to the right side, as far from the fire's approach as it could get. She opened the half-full water barrel and soaked 3 lengths of canvas she kept as backup covering, wringing them out just enough that they were wet without being heavy. She had been doing this for 3 minutes. She had maybe 7 left. She heard Colton before she saw him. His horse came in at full speed, and he pulled up short beside the wagon with his face reading a situation that had already started changing from the one he'd ridden out to handle. "You've moved the ammunition," he said, taking in what she'd done. "It's buried, center, flat. If an ember hits the wagon, it'll need to get through 3 layers of canvas and the medicine box to reach it." She handed him one of the wet canvas lengths. "The fire's coming from the northwest. If we angle the wagon southeast and keep the water barrels on the downwind side." "Lillian." He said her name the way he said it when he needed her to slow down just long enough to listen. "The herd is going to run." She stopped. When the fire gets close enough for them to smell it. 5 minutes, maybe less. When that happens, the hand's first priority is controlling the stampede, which means nobody is on this wagon but you." She understood what he was saying. "I can hold the wagon." "I know you can," he said. "But if the fire cuts between you and the rest of the crew, then it does," she said. "The supplies, the medicine, the ammunition, if we lose the wagon, we lose the ability to function for the rest of the drive. I'm not leaving it." He looked at her for a long second. She could see him deciding. "Stay on the southeast side of the wagon," he said. "Keep the water close. If it gets past what you can manage, you run. You do not stay with the wagon if you have no water left. Do you hear me?" "I hear you." "Promise me." It was the first time he had asked her to promise him anything. "I promise," she said. He held her gaze for one more beat. Then he was gone, horse already moving shouting orders toward the herd. She turned back to the wagon. She had 4 wet canvas lengths, 3.5 barrels of water, and whatever the next 30 minutes was going to bring. She started wetting down the wagon's outer canvas. The cattle smelled the fire at exactly the moment Colton had predicted. She heard the herd before she saw what it was doing. A sound that started as a low collective noise and built into something that had no good comparison, except to say that 3,000 animals, deciding to move in the same direction at once, had a sound that you felt in your chest cavity before you heard it with your ears. The stampede went northeast, away from the fire, and away from her, which was the best possible direction. And she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of relief, before she understood that the fire did not care which direction the cattle had gone. The fire was still coming. The first ember reached her 20 minutes in. She caught it on the wet canvas before it could settle, smothered it, moved to the next spot. Then another. Then 2 at once, landing on the wagon's left side where the canvas was starting to dry at the edges despite her efforts. She worked. She didn't think about fear. Fear was information, and she had already processed the information and made her decisions, and now thinking about fear was just spending energy she couldn't spare. She wet the canvas again. She moved to the left side, the fire side, and beat down a section of dry grass that had caught near the wagon's front wheel. She used the back of a cooking pan, the largest one she had, and she beat it until the grass was black and dead, and the fire had no path to the wheel. Her arms were burning. She didn't stop. The smoke was getting thicker now, the kind that got inside your lungs and stayed, and she pulled her neckerchief up over her mouth and kept moving. Then she saw Colton. She almost missed it. She was focused on the left side of the wagon when she caught movement in her peripheral vision through the smoke, and what she saw made her go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. Colton's horse had gone down. She could see the horse on its side already struggling back up, which meant it was injured, but not dead, but Colton was on the ground, and he was moving trying to get to his feet. And there was a section of the herd that had split and doubled back, terrified animals running blind in the smoke, and they were heading directly for him, and he was not going to get clear in time. She did not think. She moved. The whip was on the side of the wagon where she kept it for driving the wagon horses on difficult terrain. She had used it exactly 3 times in the entire drive, and never for anything like this. She grabbed it. She ran. Not toward safety. Not away from the thing that was coming. Toward it. Between the man on the ground and the cattle bearing down on him, she planted her feet in the dry grass, and she threw the whip out with every ounce of force she had. The crack was enormous. She had not expected it to be that loud. She had not expected the lead cattle to flinch from it. She threw it again, moving sideways, forcing the line, making herself as large and loud as she possibly could in the smoke and chaos and terrible noise. The lead animal veered. The ones behind it followed. The herd split around her like water around a stone, and the ground shook under her feet with the weight of them passing, and she did not move. She held her ground and kept the whip moving until the last of them had cleared past. Then it was quiet. Or not quiet. The fire still crackled. The cattle were still audible in the distance. The world was still full of the sounds of a disaster in progress. But quiet in the way that happens in the immediate space after something terrible either happens or doesn't. Colton was on his feet. He was looking at her. He was not a man whose face gave away large things easily. She had learned that in 35 days. She had learned to read the small signals, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes changed, the particular quality of his silences. The way he was looking at her right now was none of those small signals. It was something she had never seen on his face before. She lowered the whip. Her hands were shaking. She noticed that with some distant part of her mind. The hands that had been steady through everything, the windstorm, the water crisis, Dawson Garrett, the fire, were shaking now, after the fact, the way bodies sometimes save the shaking for after the danger was past. Colton crossed the distance between them. He didn't say anything. He took the whip from her hands, set it aside, and then he looked at her face, her hands, her arms checking the same way he checked a horse after a bad ride looking for damage. "I'm not hurt," she said. "You have burns on your left arm." She looked. She hadn't noticed. "They're shallow," she said. "You ran into a stampede," he said. "You were in the way of it." "Lillian, you were in the way of it," she said again, and her voice cracked slightly at the edges, which she had not intended, and she pressed her mouth together and looked away and breathed until it steadied. His hand came up. He put it on the side of her face very gently, which was such an unexpected thing that she went completely still. "Look at me," he said. She looked. His expression had no walls in it anymore. "Are you all right?" he asked. Not about the burns, not about the stampede. He was asking about all of it, all of the last 35 days, and every hard thing in them, and the specific particular difficulty of what she had just done. She thought about lying. She thought about saying, "Yes, fine, I'm fine," which was what she said and had been saying for 6 months, because yes, fine, I'm fine, was armor. And she had learned the hard way that taking armor off in the wrong place at the wrong time cost you things you couldn't get back. "Not entirely," she said instead. He nodded. His hand dropped. But he stood where he was close, and she understood that the closeness was deliberate and that it was its own kind of answer. "The wagon," she said. "The wagon can wait." "The ammunition." "Reese is there," he said. "I sent him when I saw you run." A pause. "Why didn't you call for me?" "There was no time. You could have screamed." "And then what?" she said. "You were on the ground. Everyone else was with the herd. There was no one to call." She met his eyes. "There was only me." He was quiet. "That's the third time," he said. "Third time for what?" "That you've handled something that most men on this crew would have walked away from." She didn't know what to say to that. "I didn't think about it," she said honestly. "I just moved." "I know," he said. "That's what I'm telling you." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she walked back to the wagon to check on the ammunition. The crew came back in groups as the fire died down. It had burned itself out against a natural break in the terrain 2 miles to the north, which was the kind of luck that you didn't deserve and couldn't plan for and simply had to receive with both hands. The herd had scattered, but not as badly as it could have. No cattle lost. 2 horses injured. One hand had taken a glancing blow from a panicked animal and had bruised ribs that weren't broken. Lillian treated the bruised ribs. She treated 2 men who had burns on their hands from trying to control the fire on the herd's southeast flank. She gave Billy cold water and had him sit still for 15 minutes because he had run through the smoke for too long and his eyes were red and streaming. She did all of this the way she did everything methodically, without drama, moving from person to person with what each one needed. But the crew was different now. She could feel it before she could see it. The men who came to her for treatment came differently than they had before, with a quality of directness of open acknowledgement that had been absent before. Reese, who had never once looked her in the eye for 35 days, met her gaze when she wrapped his burned hands and said quietly and without performance, "Thank you. For the wagon." "You would have done the same," she said. "I don't think I would have," he said. He meant it. "I think I would have run." She didn't argue with him. She tied off his bandage and told him to keep it clean. It was Hector who said it out loud. Not loudly. He wasn't built for loudness. But that evening, after the tension had drained out of the camp and the fire was going, and the meal was somehow improbably ready, because she had checked every single item in the wagon the moment the crisis passed and calculated what could still be cooked and cooked. Hector sat down near the fire and said to nobody in particular, "She ran into a stampede." Nobody responded immediately. He said it again to the same nobody in particular. "She ran into a stampede to pull Hayes out of the way." Sands took off his hat. He didn't say anything, just took it off and held it. One by one, the men at the fire went quiet in a different way than they had ever been quiet before. Not the quiet of discomfort or indifference, the quiet of people who were sitting with something real. Garrett was the one she expected least. He sat across the fire from her, and he watched her serve the meal, and when she got to him, he took his plate, and he said roughly, without looking at her, in the tone of a man who was not accustomed to this particular usage of his own voice. "What you did today, for Hayes." He stopped. Tried again. "That took more guts than half the men on this drive." She looked at him. "Eat while it's hot," she said. He nodded, looked down, but she saw his jaw move in a way that might on a different face have been the beginning of a smile. Colton ate last the way he always did. He sat across from her after the others had drifted toward their bedrolls, and he ate what she'd made without commenting on it, which was also the way he always did, because he had told her once that when you comment on food while you're eating it, you lose half the flavor. When he finished, he set the plate aside. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. "When this drive ends," he said, "I'll owe you wages and a bonus. The bonus is for the water situation, and for today. Most trail cooks earn their regular rate and nothing beyond it. You've done 3 jobs on this drive, and I intend to pay you for all of them." She held his gaze. "That's not what you wanted to tell me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It isn't." She waited. He looked at the fire. "My children need someone," he said. "Not a replacement, not someone to fill a role. They need someone who understands what it means to lose something and still choose to show up." He paused. "Emma doesn't talk much about her mother. Thomas talks about her constantly. They're both carrying it differently, and I don't always know what they need." "That's normal," Lillian said quietly. "There's no right way to carry grief. You just carry it however your hands work." He looked at her. "You'd understand them," he said. "I might," she said carefully, "or I might get it completely wrong." "You'd try," he said. "You'd show up and try. That's more than—" He stopped. She understood what he hadn't finished. "More than some people do. More than I expected. More than I allowed myself to hope for." She was not going to fill in those blanks out loud. Not tonight. Not yet. "Colton," she said. He looked at her. "How much longer is the drive?" 8 days, he said. She nodded. "Then let's get through the 8 days, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. He started to say something, then stopped, then tried again. After the 8 days, she said, "We'll talk." It wasn't a no. She needed him to know it wasn't a no, but she also needed to be careful because she had been here before. Not exactly here, but in the territory of this. The territory of letting herself believe in something, and she knew what it cost when the thing you'd believed in didn't hold. He heard it. He was a man who listened to what wasn't said as closely as what was, and he heard the not know in it, and something in him settled. 8 days, he said. 8 days, she said. He nodded and got up and went to check the perimeter the way he always did. She watched him go. Her heart was doing the thing she'd told it not to do again. The thing she'd been telling it not to do for the last 3 weeks. The thing it had apparently decided to do regardless of what she told it. She didn't fight it this time. She let it. Because she had run into a stampede today with nothing but a whip and 2 feet on the ground, and she had come out the other side. And if she could do that, then maybe she could afford to let herself want something good. Maybe she'd earned that much. She started cleaning up after the meal, moving through the familiar routine, and somewhere in the middle of it, she realized that her hands had stopped shaking. They had been steady all day. The shaking had only come after. And now it was gone. She was still here. She was still standing. And for the first time in a very long time, standing felt like something more than just surviving. It felt like a beginning. She washed the last pot and set it aside to dry, and looked up at the sky, which was clear now, completely clear, the stars coming through sharp and cold above the plains. 8 more days. She could do 8 more days. She had done 35. She had held a wagon through a windstorm, and managed water through a drought, and stopped a fight with 2 plates of food, and run into a stampede, and stood her ground against every judgment anyone had made about who she was and what she was worth. 8 days was nothing, except that 8 days was also everything. Everything that stood between where she was and the conversation she wasn't ready to have yet. The conversation that was waiting for her at the end of it, and the answer she didn't quite know yet but was beginning to understand. She picked up the clean pot and stowed it in the wagon. She checked the fire, she checked the water, she checked the ammunition box, which was undamaged exactly where she'd buried it, exactly as she'd packed it. Everything was where it should be. She went to her bedroll. She closed her eyes. And this time, for the first time in a very long time, she was asleep before she had time to be afraid of what she was hoping for. 8 days. She had said it like it was a simple thing, like it was a fence post, something fixed, something you could put your hand on and know exactly where you stood. But the 8 days that followed the fire were not simple at all. They were the most complicated 8 days of the entire drive. Not because anything went wrong. The trail was clear, the water held, the cattle moved well. The weather cooperated in a way it almost never had before. By every practical measure, the final stretch of the drive was the easiest section they'd covered. That was the problem. When there was no crisis to manage, when there was no water shortage to calculate, and no fight to step between, and no windstorm. Demanding everything she had, there was nothing to put herself behind. Nothing to use as a reason to keep her eyes on the work, instead of on the man riding at the front of the herd. She noticed him differently now. She had always noticed him. She would have been lying to herself if she pretended otherwise. But before the fire, it had been noticing with distance built into it. Noticing with the careful buffer of, I have a job to do, and this job is all I am here for. After the fire, the buffer was gone. She had used it up somewhere between grabbing the whip and looking at his face in the aftermath, and she hadn't figured out how to rebuild it. He noticed her differently too. She could feel it in the small things. He brought her coffee in the mornings now, instead of the other way around. Not every morning, not so regularly that it became something the crew would remark on, but often enough that when she came to the fire and found a cup already waiting, she knew without looking who had left it. He checked on the wagon more frequently, not with the brisk efficiency of a trail boss doing his rounds, but with the particular quality of a man looking for a reason to be somewhere. She let it happen. She was done pretending it wasn't happening. 3 days after the fire, Billy caught up with her while she was driving the chuck wagon and rode alongside for a while without saying anything. She had learned that Billy's silences were working silences. He was processing something. She waited. "Can I ask you something?" he finally said. "You're going to anyway," she said. He almost smiled. "What are you going to do after the drive ends?" She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "I haven't decided. Mr. Hayes said he has a ranch in Montana." "He mentioned it. He mentioned it to you a lot," Billy said. "Is all I'm saying." She looked at him sideways. "Billy, I think you should know that everyone on this crew has noticed," he said. "Not in a bad way. In the way where people want something good to happen, and they're hoping." She was quiet for a moment. "How old are you?" she asked. 18. "You're too young to be a matchmaker." "My mother married at 16, he said. "She says love is wasted on people who wait too long to recognize it." Lillian kept driving, but she didn't tell him to stop talking. "Your mother sounds like a sensible woman," she said finally. Billy grinned. "I'll tell her you said so," he said, and pulled his horse back toward the herd. The conversation sat with her for the rest of the day, not because it told her anything she didn't know, but because it told her that what she'd been trying to keep quiet inside herself was apparently visible to an 18-year-old boy, which meant it was almost certainly visible to the 24 other men on this drive, and which meant the only person she'd been successfully hiding it from was herself. She had been doing that a lot lately, hiding things from herself, telling herself she was being careful when what she was actually being was afraid. There was a difference, and she knew it. She had known it since the fire. On the 5th day after the fire, 40 days into the drive, Colton rode back to the wagon mid-afternoon. This was not unusual. He made rounds. He checked supply status. He had practical reasons to be at the wagon. But the way he pulled up beside her and rode at the wagon's pace for a while without saying anything told her this was not a practical visit. She waited. "I got a letter at the last supply stop," he said. "Good news or bad?" "Neither. Business." He paused. "There's a man in Miles City who's been making claims on a section of my land. Says his deed predates mine. My lawyer thinks he's wrong but wants me there within the month to sort it out." "Will it be complicated?" "Could be." Another pause. "It's the section where I've been planning to expand the grazing. If I lose it—" He stopped. "It would change things." She thought about this. "Do you trust your lawyer?" "As much as I trust any lawyer. Which is—" He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Moderately." "Do you have your own deed documents?" "At the ranch." "Then you're fine," she said. "A legitimate deed doesn't disappear because someone makes a claim. You go. You show your documentation. You let your lawyer do his job." He was quiet. "You make it sound simple," he said. "It is simple," she said. "It's not easy, but it's simple. There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. "You do that a lot," he said. "Do what?" "Take something that feels like it has 10 parts and reduce it to the one part that matters." She considered that. "I've had to. When you don't have a lot of resources, you learn to find the center of a problem fast and go straight at it. Circling costs too much." "Where did you learn that?" "The hard way," she said. "The only school that really teaches it." He nodded slowly. Then he said without preamble, without any particular change in tone, "I want you to come to Montana." She kept driving. Her hands didn't change on the reins. "We said after the drive," she said. "I know what we said. I'm saying it now." A pause. "Not because I need a cook. Not because my children need a caretaker. I want to be clear about that. I have a housekeeper. I have a ranch foreman who helps with the children when I'm working. I'm not asking you because of a gap I need to fill." She finally looked at him. "Then why?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Because the last 40 days have been the first time in 2 years that I've looked forward to the end of a day," he said. "Because when something goes wrong on this drive, you're the first person I want to tell. Because—" He stopped, tried again. "Because my daughter Emma has never met you, and I'm already certain she would love you. And because my son Thomas has never met you, and I'm already certain you would know exactly how to reach him in a way I've been failing at for 2 years. She was quiet. "And," she said. He understood what she was asking. He understood that she needed him to say the whole thing, not just the parts that sounded reasonable. "And I haven't wanted to know everything about a person in a very long time," he said. "And I want to know everything about you. How you think, what you dream about, what you would do with the south-facing kitchen window if you had it." A pause. "I want the chance to find out." She looked at the trail ahead. She thought about James. She thought about how much she had loved him, and how fast she had lost him, and what it had done to her. Not just the grief, but the secondary damage of discovering how much the world diminished you when the person anchoring your social worth was gone. She thought about her uncle's house, about the word decent applied as a weapon by a man in a firelit camp. She thought about what it would mean to try again, not just to trust someone, to trust herself, her own judgment, her own heart. "I'm afraid," she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said to anyone since James died. Colton didn't flinch from it. "I know," he said. "I'm afraid too." "Of the same thing." "Probably different versions of the same thing," he said. "I'm afraid of—" He paused, and she could see the effort of saying something true cost him something. "Of choosing wrong. Of bringing someone into my children's lives and having it hurt them. of wanting something and losing it again. She absorbed that. "That's honest," she said. "You deserve honest." She looked at him. He was watching her with the same steadiness he brought to everything. Storm stampedes, difficult men, hard decisions. The same steadiness he'd had the morning he found her in the dark before the drive started. But there was something underneath it now that she recognized, because it was the same thing she'd been carrying. Hope. The frightening, inconvenient, entirely unwelcome kind. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. "That's all I'm asking," he said, and meant it. He pulled his horse away from the wagon and rode back toward the herd. She drove. She thought. She was still thinking about it 2 days later when everything went sideways. The trouble arrived in the form of a man named Pierce. He came riding into camp on the 42nd day of the drive, just before the noon meal, which Lillian had already prepared, and which was sitting covered and waiting for the hands to come in from the morning's work. Pierce introduced himself to Colton with the easy confidence of someone who had practiced his own introduction and knew it worked. He was well dressed for trail country. He was pleasant-faced. He had the specific kind of smile that Lillian recognized immediately because she'd seen it on men who had something to sell that wasn't worth what they were asking. She stayed near the wagon. She listened. Pierce said he represented a cattle buying consortium out of Chicago, said he'd been tracking the Hayes drive for 2 weeks, said he had an offer that was significantly above market rate for the entire herd delivered here instead of at the end of the trail. "I can save you 3 days of drive time," Pierce said. "Pay you now, take delivery here. You'd be ahead by 3 days of wages for your crew, 3 days of supplies, and a price per head better than you'll get in Miles City." Colton listened without expression. "I'd want to see the documentation," Colton said. "Of course," Pierce said. He produced a paper. Colton read it. Lillian watched Colton's face while he read, which she had learned was more informative than reading whatever document he held. She watched the way his eyes moved across the paper and then moved back. Not the natural reread of someone absorbing information, but the specific reread of someone looking for what wasn't there. When Colton finished, he folded the paper carefully and handed it back. "I'll need time to consider," he said. Pierce's smile held. "Of course. I'll be nearby. Day's end soon enough for an answer." "Day's end is fine," Colton said. Pierce rode off toward the edge of camp to wait. Colton turned and walked to the wagon. He picked up a cup of coffee without asking. Which he never did. He always waited for her to offer. She noted the cup and said nothing. "What's wrong with it?" she asked quietly. He looked at her over the cup. "What makes you think something's wrong? You read it twice. You folded it before you handed it back. And you're drinking coffee without sitting down, which means you're thinking on your feet about something that bothers you." He set the cup down. "The consortium name on the document," he said quietly. "I've been doing business in this territory for 12 years. I've never heard of it." "Is that unusual? For a group claiming to have Chicago money and regional buying history?" "Yes." He paused. "The price he's offering is 15% above what the Miles City buyers quoted me." "Is that impossible?" "It's not impossible," he said. "It's suspicious. The kind of price you offer when you're not actually planning to pay it." She thought about that. What happens if you sell and his payment doesn't clear? "I've already delivered the herd." She absorbed the implications of that. 35 days of work, 25 men's wages, the ranch's operating income for the next year. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to send Sands into town to ask around about the consortium." He paused. "It's a 2-hour ride each way. I won't have an answer before I have to give Pierce one." "Then stall him." He looked at her. "Tell him you need until morning," she said. "Business decision of this size your lawyer needs to review. It's a reasonable request. If he pushes back hard on a reasonable request, that tells you something important." Colton was quiet. "And if he agrees to morning?" "Then you have until morning, and Sands has 4 extra hours." He held her gaze for a moment. "You're right," he said. He went to find Pierce. She watched from the wagon. Pierce's smile held when Colton made the request. He said morning was perfectly fine. No push, no pressure. Colton came back. He agreed too easily, he said. What does that mean? It means either he's genuinely patient or he thinks he doesn't need to pressure me because he's already set something up that I don't know about yet. She went cold. Your deed documents, she said. He looked at her. The ones you said were at the ranch, she said slowly. The ones your lawyer needs for the land dispute in Miles City. What about them? If someone wanted to buy your herd at below market rate after you'd already delivered it and couldn't collect, the most effective way to do that would be to make sure you were also dealing with a simultaneous legal problem that drained your resources and your attention. She paused. You said the land claim came out of nowhere. You said you'd never heard of the man making it. Colton was completely still. You think they're connected, he said. I think the timing is very specific, she said. A land claim on your most valuable grazing section appeared right before a man with Chicago money finds you on the trail and offers above market rates. If he gets the herd without paying fully and the land claim succeeds, I lose the herd income and the section, Colton said. His voice had gone flat and hard in a way she hadn't heard before. The ranch can't carry that, not both. I know, she said. He looked at her. How do you know this? He said. Not a challenge, genuine. My husband was a surveyor, she said. He told me about men who worked this scheme on smaller landowners. They'd manufacture a legal problem on one side while running a buyer's fraud on the other, and by the time you figured out what was happening, you'd already lost the leverage to fight either one. He was quiet. Then he said, I need to send a second rider, not just to check the consortium, to get a message to my lawyer tonight. Do it, she said, and don't let Pierce out of your sight. He went to find Sands. She watched him go and thought about what she'd just done, about the information she'd carried from her dead husband's work, and applied without planning to save the man standing in front of her from a scheme designed to take everything he had. She thought about James, about the evenings he'd come home from surveying work with stories about the land, about who owned what and what it was worth, and how men with money and lawyers sometimes turned legal machinery into a weapon against people who had less of both. She had listened. She had always listened. She hadn't known she was storing it for this. But she had been. It took Sands 4 hours each way. He came back after dark, after Pierce had eaten supper at the edge of the camp, with the particular patience of a man who had decided he had already won, and he had his report. The consortium didn't exist. Or rather, it existed on paper in documents filed 2 months ago in a county office, with addresses that led to empty buildings and names that belonged to no one anyone in the area had met. It was a front. The scheme was exactly what Lillian had described. Colton heard Sands's report with his jaw set and his eyes steady, and when Sands finished, he said, All right, don't let Pierce know anything's changed. I'll handle it in the morning. How? Sands asked. I'll ask him some questions, Colton said. Let him tell me how much he knows. Lillian said nothing, but after Sands left, she said quietly, You should have the sheriff's office notified before you confront him. If he panics, nearest sheriff is 12 miles. Then send someone tonight, she said. Before morning. Don't confront him without legal backing. You don't know who else he has waiting. Colton looked at her. You think he has backup? I think a scheme this organized doesn't have a single person behind it, she said. I think Pierce is the face of something larger, and that if you corner him alone, you'll have a man with nothing to lose. He held her gaze. You're not wrong, he said. He sent Billy with a message to the sheriff's office that night. Pierce slept at the edge of camp. Colton didn't sleep at all. Neither did Lillian. She knew because she was awake at 2 a.m. when he made his perimeter check, and he stopped when he saw her fire was still going. You should sleep, he said. So should you, she said. He sat down. She poured coffee. They sat in the quiet, the way they had learned to sit, the easy silence of two people who had gotten past the part where silence was uncomfortable. "If this works," he said, "if the scheme gets stopped and the land claim gets dismissed." "It will," she said. "You don't know that. I know that a man with legitimate documentation and a lawyer who knows what he's doing and a fraudulent opponent whose paper trail falls apart under scrutiny is in a strong position," she said. "I know that because James told me. He said the law is slow, but it generally lands on the side of the person with the real paperwork." "James sounds like a good man," Colton said. She was quiet. "He was," she said. "He was patient and funny and kind, and he died too young." A pause. "He would have liked you, I think." "What makes you say that?" "You're honest," she said. "He valued that above almost everything. He said it was the rarest thing." She looked at the fire. "He wasn't wrong." Colton was quiet for a moment. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly," he said. She looked at him. "Do you want to come to Montana?" Not could she. Not would she. Did she want to? She thought about the south-facing kitchen window. She thought about Emma, who she'd never met, and Thomas, who Colton said talked constantly about his mother, and who she already knew from the shape of what Colton had told her, was a child who loved deeply and didn't know what to do with loving when the thing you loved was gone. She thought about 35 days of being useful in a way that was real, in a way that she chose, in a way that nobody had handed her and nobody could take away. She thought about the wooden handle. She thought about her name and his voice in the dark. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. Just a breath, but one that carried the weight of someone who had been holding something for a long time. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. They sat until the fire burned low. Neither of them moved to end it. The morning arrived the way mornings on the trail always arrived, with the particular indifference of a world that did not pause for anything human. Not even a man running a fraudulent cattle scheme. Not even two people who had just decided something important in the dark. Pierce came to breakfast. He ate. He watched Colton with the unhurried confidence of a man who thought he had all the cards. He did not know that Billy had ridden 12 miles in the dark, and that the sheriff's deputy had ridden 12 miles back and was currently waiting at the edge of camp in clothes that looked like trail clothes, but who Colton had spoken to privately before anyone else was awake. He did not know that Sands had quietly positioned himself and two of the largest hands at casual points around the perimeter. He did not know that Lillian had packed a detailed written account of everything she knew about the scheme, the timeline, the connection to the land, claimed the names from the consortium filing, and given it to Colton at 4 in the morning. He found out about all of these things at once. When Colton walked to where Pierce sat and said very calmly, very quietly, "We need to talk about the Meridian Land Consortium." Pierce's face changed, not dramatically, not the way it changed in stories. It changed the way a real face changes when a careful person realizes the situation is not what they believed it to be, a small shift, quickly controlled, but not controlled quickly enough. "I don't know what you mean," Pierce said. "The filing address in Holt County," Colton said. "Empty building. The agent of record, a man named Thomas Cale. No one in the territory has met him. The land claim on my north section filed 8 weeks ago, 2 weeks after the consortium papers were registered." He paused. "Those are the things I mean." Pierce looked around. He saw Sands. He saw the two large hands. He saw the deputy stepping forward. Whatever calculation he had been running in his head arrived at a new answer. He didn't run. There was, to his credit, a moment where Lillian thought he might try, but he didn't. He put his hands up instead. Not high, just slightly, just enough. "I want a lawyer," he said. "You'll get one," Colton said. "In Miles City." He walked Pierce to the deputy without another word. He came back to where Lillian was standing near the wagon. The entire crew was watching. He stopped in front of her. "Documented," he said. "Your account. The deputy has it." "Will it hold?" Combined with Sands' report and the filing records, he says yes. He paused. The land claim was registered by the same group. Once Pierce's connection to it is established, the claim gets dismissed. She let herself exhale. Then from somewhere in the crew, she never knew exactly who started it, there was a sound. Not cheering exactly. More like the collective exhale of 25 men who had been watching something tense resolve itself and the sound it made when it did. Garrett stood up. He was never going to be a man who made grand speeches. That was not who he was. But he stood up and he looked at Lillian, and he said roughly directly with no performance attached, "That was you, all of it." She looked at him. "It was all of us," she said. "No," he said. "It was you." He sat back down. Nobody contradicted him. Colton looked at her. She looked back. And standing there in the morning light with 24 men around them and the last miles of the drive ahead and Miles City waiting at the end of it, she understood something she hadn't let herself understand before. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She hadn't been for a while. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was made to do with a man who had seen every part of her, the steadiness and the fear and the grief and the strength, and who had not once tried to make her smaller. She had been widowed at 20. She had been told she was a burden. She had been called cookie and looked through and dismissed. She had held on through windstorms and water shortages and stampedes and fraud schemes and every quiet indignity in between. And she was still here, still standing, still against all the odds she'd been given, deciding what came next. Miles City arrived the way the end of hard things always arrived, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a gradual accumulation of signs that told you the worst was behind you before you were ready to believe it. The last 2 days of the drive were quiet. Not the tense quiet of waiting for something to go wrong, but the specific quiet of a crew that had been through something together and had come out the other side with a different understanding of each other. The men talked less, not because they had less to say, but because some things had been said already, not in words, but in actions, in the way Reese had held out his burned hands for her to wrap, in the way Garrett had stood up and said, "That was you," without being asked, in the way Sands had ridden 12 miles in the dark without once complaining about the distance. She drove the chuck wagon into Miles City on a Tuesday morning with the sun at her back and 25 men behind her, and she thought about the woman who had stood on a main street in Amarillo with 52 cents and a cloth bag 6 weeks ago. She barely recognized her. The cattle sold in 3 hours. The price was fair. Not the inflated number Pierce had promised with money that didn't exist, but the real number. The number that meant something because it was going to clear. Colton handled the transaction with the same economy he brought to everything direct, prepared, no wasted time. She watched from outside the buyer's office. When he came out, he looked at her first. Not at Sands, who was standing closer. Not at Hector, who had ridden with him for 6 years. At her. "It cleared," he said. "Of course it did," she said. He almost smiled. Wages were paid out under a large oak at the edge of town. Colton went through the crew one by one, and she watched the handshakes and the brief words exchanged with each man, the private shorthand of people who had trusted each other with difficult work and come through it. She stayed near the wagon and gave the men space for it. Billy was the first one to come to her after. He took off his hat, which he had never done before in her presence. That was Sands's gesture, and she hadn't expected it from an 18-year-old. "I'm going home to see my mother," he said. "Good," she said. "Tell her the thing she said about love, about people who wait too long. Tell her someone on the trail agreed with her." He grinned, the genuine, unguarded grin of a boy who was still young enough to let good things land fully. "Are you staying in Miles City?" he asked. "No," she said. He understood what that meant. He put his hat back on. "I'm glad you were our cook," he said. "I'm glad you were there." He said it the way young people say the true things, simply directly, without knowing quite how much weight it carried. She felt it all. "Thank you, Billy," she said. "Take care of those hands." He laughed and walked away. Sands came next. He didn't say anything. He took off his hat, held it for a moment, put it back on, and nodded at her once. It was enough. Hector shook her hand formally with both of his, which she understood was a significant gesture from a man who kept most of his warmth below the surface. Even Garrett. He came last, which she suspected was deliberate. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her with the expression of a man who had something to say and was working out whether he had the vocabulary for it. "My wife's name is Clara," he said finally. She waited. "She wrote me that letter because she was scared," he said. "I've been gone a long time. She worries." He paused. "What I said that night at the fire, about decent women, Clara wouldn't have said that. That was me being I was wrong." She looked at him steadily. "You're going home to her?" she asked. "Tonight," he said. "Then go," she said. "That's the right thing." He nodded. He started to turn away. "Garrett." He turned back. "Tell Clara she's lucky," Lillian said. "A man who admits when he's wrong is not a common thing." Something shifted in Garrett's face. Not a smile exactly, but something real. He touched his hat brim and walked away. Colton found her 20 minutes later. The crew had dispersed, some toward the saloon, some toward the hotel, some already riding out toward wherever they came from. The wagon stood empty beside the buyer's yard. The trail was over. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. 6 weeks of words between them. 6 weeks of mornings and evenings and crises and confessions and coffee in the dark. And now, standing in ordinary daylight in an ordinary town, both of them knew that what happened next was not trail business anymore. It was something else entirely. "The land claim," she said, because she needed to say something that wasn't the main thing yet. "My lawyer sent word this morning," he said. "Pierce is cooperating. His backers are being named. The claim will be dismissed within the month." "Good," she said. "I told you it would hold." "You did," he said. A pause. "I have to ride for the ranch in the morning," he said. "Thomas and Emma have been with the housekeeper for 6 weeks. Emma will be fine, but Thomas—" He stopped. "Thomas has a hard time when I'm gone long." She nodded. "How long is the ride to the ranch?" 3 days, he said. "Give or take." "I see." He looked at her. "I would like you to come with me," he said. "Not, I want to be clear. I'm not asking you to make any decision today. I'm asking you to make the ride, to see the ranch, to meet my children." A pause. "After that, whatever you decide, I'll respect it." She studied his face. In 6 weeks, she had become very good at reading this face. She knew the difference between what it showed and what was underneath, and right now both layers were saying the same thing, which was that he meant exactly what he said, and nothing beyond it, that he was offering her the chance to see the thing before she decided about the thing, and that the decision was genuinely hers. She thought about the south-facing kitchen window. She thought about Emma, who was curious about everything and afraid of nothing. She thought about Thomas, 8 years old, serious, talking constantly about his mother, which was what children did when they loved someone they'd lost and needed to make sure the world remembered. "I'll need to buy a few things before we leave," she said. He went still. "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes to the ride," she said carefully. "The rest is still the rest." "Understood," he said. He was trying not to show how much that answer meant to him. He was not entirely succeeding. She noticed. She let it go without comment, because some things were kinder left unspoken, and because she was also trying not to show how much her own answer meant to her. They left Miles City the next morning at first light. Just the two of them, which was different from 6 weeks of 25 men and constant noise and the particular social texture of a large working crew. Different and quiet, and she found not uncomfortable. The kind of quiet that came from already knowing someone well enough that silence wasn't a problem to be solved. They rode. They talked when there was something to say. On the first evening, she asked him about the housekeeper. "Mrs. Draper," he said. "She's been with us since she came the winter after my wife died. She's a good woman, efficient. The children respect her." "Do they love her?" He considered that honestly. "Emma has warmed to her," he said. Thomas is polite, but polite is Thomas keeping something at distance. He sounds like someone else I know, she said. He looked at her sideways. I'm warm, he said. She managed to keep her expression entirely straight. Extremely warm, she said. He made a sound that was definitely a laugh this time, real unguarded, the kind of laugh that didn't happen when someone was performing amusement, but only when something actually got through. She filed it away. She wanted to remember the first time she'd heard him laugh like that. On the second evening, he told her more about his wife. Her name had been Sarah. She had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a minister, and she had come west at 19 with the specific kind of courage that looks like recklessness until you understand the person. She had loved the ranch immediately, not despite its difficulty, but because of it. She had planted a kitchen garden in the first spring that still grew 7 years later, managed now by whoever had time for it. Emma waters it, Colton said. She doesn't know why exactly. She was too young to remember Sarah doing it, but she does it. Lillian thought about that. Children carry things they don't know they're carrying, she said. Yes, he said. The garden is good, she said. It's a way of being connected to something without having to understand the connection. Emma found it herself. That matters. He was quiet for a while. Sarah would have liked you, he said. It was almost exactly what she had said about James. She felt the symmetry of it, two people each carrying someone they'd lost, each trying to figure out what it meant to bring those losses forward into something new, without betraying either the lost thing or the new one. I hope so, she said. I would have liked to know her. He nodded. They rode in silence after that, but it was a full silence, not an empty one. The kind that happened between people who had said enough. The ranch appeared on the afternoon of the third day. She had heard him describe it enough times that she had built a version of it in her mind. But the thing she noticed when they rode in wasn't the structure, or the land, or the garden that she knew must be there somewhere. It was the sound. The sound of a child running. Emma came out of the house at full speed, the way only 6-year-olds moved, completely committed to the direction, no braking system engaged, and she hit Colton at knee level before he'd fully dismounted, wrapping both arms around his legs. You were gone forever, she announced. 6 weeks, he said. That's forever, she said. He picked her up, which she clearly expected settling onto his hip with the ease of a child who knew exactly where she belonged. Then Emma looked at Lillian, not with suspicion, not with shyness, with the direct, unfiltered assessment of a very young child who had not yet learned that staring was impolite. Who are you? She asked. My name is Lillian, she said. You came from the cattle drive. I did. Did you ride a horse? I drove the wagon. Emma considered this with great seriousness. The wagon is important, she said finally. Papa says the wagon is how everyone eats. Your papa is right, Lillian said. Emma looked at her father. She can stay for supper, Emma announced, as though this were entirely her decision. Colton met Lillian's eyes over Emma's head. She kept her face straight. Thank you, she told Emma. I'd like that. Mrs. Draper appeared in the doorway, then a solid, capable-looking woman in her 50s who took in the situation with the quick assessment of someone who had been managing a household long enough to read a room in 3 seconds. She looked at Lillian. She looked at Colton. She looked at the way Emma was already leaning sideways out of Colton's arms toward Lillian, as though testing the distance. Something in Mrs. Draper's expression settled. I'll set another place, she said, and went back inside. Thomas was harder. He appeared from the direction of the barn, walking with the deliberate, measured pace of a boy who had decided not to run, and he stopped several feet away from his father and stood with his arms at his sides and his chin level, which was the posture of a child, trying very hard to look like he hadn't missed anyone. Colton went to him. He put a hand on the boy's shoulder and said something too quiet for Lillian to hear, and Thomas's chin dropped very briefly before he got it back up. Whatever his father said, it mattered. She could see it landing. Then Thomas looked at her. 8 years old. Dark eyes like his father. A face that was working very hard to be composed. Are you the cook? he asked. "I was on the drive," she said. "Papa wrote about you." She looked at Colton, who was studying something fascinating on the horizon. "Did he?" she said. "He said you saved his life," Thomas said. "I helped," she said. "Other people helped too." Thomas absorbed this. "He doesn't usually write about people," the boy said. "He writes about the cattle and the miles and the weather. He doesn't write about people." She understood what that information was meant to communicate. "I see," she said. Thomas looked at her for another long moment. "We have a kitchen garden," he said. "Emma waters it, but she doesn't know what things are. I know what things are. If you want, I could show you." She understood this too. A boy who loved his mother. A boy who kept her garden alive in his mind, because his sister kept it alive in the ground. A boy who was offering her the most important thing he had. "I would really like that," she said. Thomas nodded once. Very serious, very ate. "After supper," he said, and went back toward the barn. She stood there for a moment. Then she turned to Colton. "He doesn't write about people," she said. "Thomas exaggerates," Colton said. "Does he?" "Sometimes." "What did you write?" He looked at her directly. "The truth," he said. "That's all." She let it go. But she didn't let it go really. She tucked it somewhere warm and kept it. Supper was the most ordinary and most extraordinary meal she had been part of in years. Mrs. Draper had made a simple roast with preserved vegetables and bread, and Lillian helped without being asked, and without making a production of it. She simply came into the kitchen and started doing what was useful, and Mrs. Draper let her, which was its own kind of welcome. Emma talked through the entire meal. About the garden. About a bird that had built a nest in the fence post nearest the barn. About a book Mrs. Draper had been reading to her, and which had a horse in it, and whether the horse in the book was like any of the horses on the ranch. Colton answered her with the patient attentiveness of a father who had been away for 6 weeks and was relearning the sound of his daughter's voice. Thomas ate carefully and said very little, but twice he looked at Lillian with a question in his face that he didn't voice. The second time she caught his eye. "The one your father wrote about," she said quietly, while Emma was explaining the bird's nest situation to Mrs. Draper. "The woman who saved his life, she was just trying to do what was right. That's all anyone was doing out there." Thomas looked at his plate. "Did you know anyone who died?" he asked, quietly, carefully. She understood immediately that this was not a random question. "Yes," she said. "My husband. He died last year." Thomas was very still. "Did it get better?" he asked. She felt the question go straight through her. "It changed," she said honestly. "It doesn't get better the way a cut heals, but it changes. You learn to carry it differently." She paused. "And you find that there are things that help. People, work, gardens that need watering." Thomas looked up at her. Something in his face, the careful, controlled composure he'd been maintaining, shifted. Just slightly. "Mama's rosemary is still alive," he said. "It's harder to kill than the other things." "Rosemary is tough," she said. "It likes hard conditions." "Like people," he said. She looked at this 8-year-old boy. "Yes," she said, "exactly like people." He nodded, went back to his food. But something had opened. She could feel it, the specific sensation of a door that had been shut for a long time, moving just slightly on its hinges. Not open, not yet, but no longer sealed. After supper, Thomas showed her the garden. He walked her through it in the evening light, with the serious authority of someone who knew his subject. "This is the rosemary. This is what Mama planted first. This is the section Emma tends, and you can tell because it's a little uneven. This is where we lost the lavender last winter. But I think it's coming back." She listened to all of it. She asked questions, real ones, not the performing interest kind. She asked about the winter conditions, about what the soil needed, about whether he'd tried companion planting in the far section. Thomas looked at her sharply. "You know about companion planting." "My mother kept a garden," she said. She believed that some plants grew better next to certain others. Whether she was right, I'm not entirely sure, but the garden always produced well. Thomas was quiet, thinking. I read about it, he said. In a book. I asked Mrs. Draper to get it from the lending library. She did. A pause. I tried it with the tomatoes this year. I put basil next to them. How did they do? Good, he said, with the studied nonchalance of someone very pleased with himself. Better than last year. Your mother would have approved, she said. She hadn't planned to say it. She wasn't sure if it was the right thing. But Thomas stopped walking and stood very still, and then said in a voice that was doing a great deal of work to stay even, Did you know her? No, she said. But I know you. And I know what you've kept alive here. That tells me a great deal about her. She paused. The things that matter to people, the things they pass on, even without meaning to, those things don't lie. Thomas stood there for a long moment. Then he turned and pointed to the far corner of the garden. That's where I want to try the lavender again, he said. Different location. More shelter. Sounds right, she said. They walked to the far corner together. Colton watched from the porch. He had told himself he wasn't going to watch. He had given her the garden tour with Thomas the way you give someone space genuinely without hovering. But he had ended up on the porch anyway, in the way that men ended up in the places where the things they cared about most were happening. He watched his son walk through the garden with Lillian. He watched Thomas point to things and explain them. He watched Lillian lean down to look at something close to the ground that Thomas was showing her. He watched Thomas laugh at something she said. Thomas had not laughed easily since his mother died. He had smiled occasionally. He had been polite and composed and quietly helpful in all the ways that broke Colton's heart, because they were the signs of a child managing himself too carefully, holding himself in with both hands, because no one had told him he was allowed to put some of it down. He was laughing now. Colton looked at the sky. He breathed. He thought about everything about Sarah, about the 2 years since, about the ranch, and the children, and the long specific loneliness of being responsible for everything, and unable to share any of it with the person you'd built it for. He thought about Lillian on the first morning of the drive, telling him the old handle would have failed eventually, as though problems were simply things you identified and addressed, as though nothing was too hard if you went straight at the center of it. He thought about the whip cracking in the smoke and the sound of it reaching him on the ground, and the sight of her small steady, completely committed to the direction standing between him and the herd. He had known then. He had been trying to be careful about it since then, trying to give her room, trying not to press, because he understood that what she'd been through had cost her things that couldn't be replaced quickly, and that trust. Real trust, the kind you'd build a life on, wasn't something you rushed. But he had known. She came back from the garden without Thomas, who had apparently been enlisted by Emma to settle a dispute about the bird's nest that required his immediate expertise. She came up the porch steps and stopped beside him and looked out at the same thing he was looking at, the darkening sky, the quiet of the ranch settling into evening. He showed me where his mother planted the rosemary first, she said. I know that spot, Colton said. He knows everything about that garden, she said. Every plant. What conditions they like, what she chose and why. He's kept her alive in it. She paused. You should tell him that it's an extraordinary thing. He knows. He needs to hear it, she said. Children who carry things need to hear that the carrying is seen. Otherwise, they start to think it's a burden they were given instead of a gift they chose. He looked at her. When did you get so wise about children? He asked. I had a very good teacher, she said. He was 8 years old and he knew everything about companion planting. He almost smiled. Then, Emma's voice erupted from inside the house, directing her brother with the volume and authority of someone twice her size, and both of them turned toward the sound, and then back to each other, and the almost smile became real. She looked at him. He looked at her. And this was the moment she felt it clearly, the way you feel the exact second when something shifts from almost to fully, from possible to real. "I want to stay," she said. He went completely still. "Not because I have nowhere else to go," she said. "I want to be clear about that. That's not why. I could find work. I could manage. I know that now in a way I didn't know 6 weeks ago." She held his gaze. "I want to stay because Thomas needs someone who will hear him. And Emma needs someone who will not try to contain her. And you need—" She stopped. Started again. "You need someone who isn't afraid of the hard days," she said. "And I'm not. I've had enough hard days that they don't scare me anymore. They're just days. You get through them." He didn't say anything for a long moment. His jaw moved. "Lillian," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm going to—" "I know," she said again. He crossed the porch in 2 steps. He put his hands on either side of her face carefully, the way he'd done in the smoke after the stampede, and she held his gaze with her whole self, not bracing, not afraid, completely present. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to court you properly. I want to give you time. I want—" "Colton," she said. He stopped. "I ran into a stampede," she said. "I think we're past slowly." He looked at her for one more beat. Then he laughed, that real laugh, the one she'd first heard on the trail, and it was even better up close, and she felt it move through her like the first warm morning after a long winter. He pressed his forehead to hers. Neither of them moved. From inside the house, Emma shrieked with laughter at something. Thomas's voice followed lower, trying to be stern, failing completely. "They're going to notice we're out here," Colton said. "Emma definitely already knows," Lillian said. "She's 6. "She's extremely perceptive," Lillian said. "She told me the wagon was important. A child like that misses nothing." He lifted his head. He looked at her face. "Stay," he said. "Not asking, not quite. The way you say something, when you know the answer, but still need to hear it said back." "I'm staying," she said. The months that followed were not easy. She had known they wouldn't be. She had learned in the hardest way available not to expect the good things to arrive without their own difficulties attached. And the difficulties came not catastrophically, not in the form of prairie fires or fraud schemes or stampedes, but in the quieter forms that turned out to be harder to navigate than the dramatic ones. Thomas went through a period 3 weeks after her arrival where he pulled back. Without warning or obvious cause, he became distant and careful again, polite in the way Colton had described holding something at arm's length that he had been beginning to let closer. She watched it happen, and she did not push. She did not engineer situations designed to pull him back. She simply kept doing what she had been doing, keeping the garden asking him questions when he was near leaving space. She told Colton when he asked that it was fine. "It's not fine," he said. "He was doing better, and now he's 8 years old and something in him got scared," she said. He got close, and it felt too much like something he'd already lost, and he needed to pull back to check if the thing was real. She looked at Colton. "Let him pull back. He'll come back out when he's sure I'm still here." "How long?" "As long as he needs." Colton looked at her. "How are you so sure?" "Because that's what I did," she said. "Every time I started to trust something, I pulled back to check if it would still be there." He was quiet. "Was I still there?" he asked. She looked at him. "You're here, aren't you?" she said. Thomas came back in his own time. It was a Tuesday morning, unremarkable in every way, when he appeared at the kitchen door while she was making bread and asked without preamble whether she thought the lavender would survive being transplanted in October. She didn't make anything of it. She simply answered the question. And they talked about lavender for 20 minutes, and then about the rest of the garden, and then about the book he was reading, and then he went to school, and she went back to the bread. She stood at the kitchen counter, the south-facing one which got the morning light exactly the way she'd always wanted, and she felt the full quiet weight of what had just happened. Not the dramatic version, the real version. A boy who had been afraid had walked through a door and sat down. That was all. That was everything. Emma never needed the distance. Emma arrived fully immediately and permanently. She developed the habit of appearing in whatever room Lillian occupied, and providing running commentary on current events, which included the bird's nest, the garden, the status of every animal on the ranch, and detailed critiques of Mrs. Draper's bread versus Lillian's bread, which she delivered to both women without apparent concern for diplomacy. Mrs. Draper found this hilarious. "She told me mine was more reliable," Mrs. Draper said one morning with great composure. "She told me mine was more interesting," Lillian said. They looked at each other. "She's not wrong about either," Mrs. Draper said. Lillian decided she loved Mrs. Draper. The wedding was in January, which was too cold for a large outdoor gathering, and too meaningful to wait for better weather. Colton had asked her in November in the kitchen on a Thursday morning with Thomas in the next room, and Emma somewhere overhead, and Mrs. Draper pointedly deciding that was the exact moment she needed something from the far end of the property. He hadn't made a speech. He had stood across the kitchen table from her and said, "Will you marry me?" with the same directness he brought to everything, and she had said yes with the same directness she brought to everything. And they had stood there for a moment on either side of the table with the morning light coming through the south-facing window. Then Emma came downstairs and immediately understood what had happened. Emma, who missed nothing, and announced it to Thomas, who appeared in the doorway with his careful face and stood there for a moment, and then without ceremony walked across the kitchen and put his arms around Lillian's waist. He didn't say anything. He held on. She held on back. Colton watched his son, who had been holding everything at arm's length for 2 years, choose to put something down. He pressed his thumb to the corner of his eye. He thought he was subtle. He was not remotely subtle. "Papa's crying," Emma announced. "I'm not," he said. "Your eyes are wet," Emma said. "It's dry in here." Emma looked at Lillian. Lillian looked at Emma. "Very dry." Lillian agreed. Thomas made a sound against her side. It took her a moment to realize he was laughing. The January wedding was small ranch hands. Mrs. Draper, a minister who had ridden out from town and who seemed genuinely moved by the occasion in the way that people were moved by things that felt earned. She wore a dress that was not white because she was a widow and had earned the right to acknowledge that, and Colton wore his good jacket and his best hat and looked at her when she came to stand beside him with a face that had no walls in it at all. "You ready?" he said. "I ran into a stampede," she said. He laughed. The minister married them with Thomas on one side and Emma on the other. Both of them serious in the way children were serious during important things, and when it was done, Colton took her hand and held it, and Emma immediately took her other hand, and Thomas took his father's, and for a moment they stood there, the four of them connected in a line. A family. Not the shape of one, not the performance of one. The real thing with all its difficulty and history and love and loss woven into it. None of it erased all of it, present, all of it carried forward. She had been widowed at 20. She had been told she was a burden. She had cooked for cowboys who called her Cookie and looked through her for 6 weeks of hard miles across difficult country. She had held on through everything. The windstorms and the stampedes and the fraud schemes and the long nights of grief and the quiet persistent indignity of being underestimated by people who should have known better. She had run toward the hard things instead of away from them. She had told the truth in the dark. She had stayed, and here in a kitchen with south-facing windows, with a husband who had seen every part of her and chosen her with open eyes, and a boy who now came through the door easily, and a girl who carried warmth the way other people carried their names. Here was the thing she had not known to hope for. Not rescue. Not someone saving her from her circumstances. But a life she had built piece by piece with her own hands out of everything the world had tried to take from her. Lillian Hart did not need the world to see her worth. She had known it all along through every storm, every fire. Every morning, she had gotten up and started the work when it would have been easier to stop. And she had never once put it down.